Okay, starts. Starts are highly dependent on everything that we've done to this point. Okay, if you haven't, if you've done any of what I've shown you in the series of videos leading to this point, if you've done any of it in reverse, okay, if you've tried to tune any of these coolant offset maps, the start extraverse temp maps, or the warm-up enrichments, or if you've tried to really do any of this before what I've shown you in the previous videos at operating temperature, all this is pretty much useless. Now, if some of you more experienced guys, you can start guessing at it. You've seen enough maps. You know that if you get your fuel map close enough, as it's warming up, you can still guess it and kind of do an in-between, and do a little bit of the starts prior to doing everything fully warmed up. But all of this is going to be done. It's probably going to take several times to get all of this right. Now, if you've done several cars with exactly the same setup, still each car is different, but you can start kind of guessing at the relative ranges that will provide, pretty good, cranks and idle after starts and things like that. And this is all going to be so much easier because we've already done our base fuel map. By now you guys should have this part right here really close to being where it should be with fuel, okay? And then over here in idle, we've got all this really close. You guys have got this really close right now. So these start maps, they kind of just fall right into place, okay? Everything that you've done to this point, it's just playing with these certain values to get the car to crank up just those couple cranks faster, or start really strong instead of like it kind of catches 500 or 600 and waits and then slowly climbs to your idle speed at that particular coolant temperature. So what we're gonna do, I'm gonna start over here in the options, fuel pump prime. You can set this to whatever you want, personal preference, 5 seconds, 6 seconds, doesn't matter. I think it caps at 15 or something like that. Yeah, 16. Crank advance. If you're on gasoline, gasoline usually really likes a value of 12, 15, 16, something like that. On most of my stuff, it's worked very well. Sometimes a value of 8 or something like that can make it just that much better. This isn't a huge factor, mainly because it's a static value, and in a few other tuning systems, there's actually a 2D base table. In the new Infinity, it's also like this. You can change the degrees per RPM. So at 0, it's at something, and then at 50 RPM, it's at 5, and then at 100 RPM, it's at 10, and you can increase it like that. But this isn't a huge factor because it's only a static value. It's the same all the time. Crank inject all, you'll usually want that on. It helps a little bit. If you turn it off and you get a little better starts, that's fine. You're just going to play with this, but usually crank inject all. It deals with how your injectors fire in this initial crank pulse and the crank injector time. But on is usually pretty good. The crank min 50, crank max 400, you don't need to change those. Those are fine just where they're at. And then the AC min RPM, you actually noticed this is just a duplicate option to change. It's the same thing that was over there in the idle. This is the same thing. It just happens to be here too. Okay, so what is initial crank pulse? What this is, think of it like an initial extra burst of fuel prior to this graph. Think of it, left to right. This happens first prior to this. Okay, so it generally has a slope from left to right, and then is usually the same once you've hit full operating temperature. ethanol guys, with larger injectors, you start getting those that have done it for a while. You start seeing really interesting values, like what you can actually do is go in and cap all of these values, and you'll notice that whenever it's cold, it needs, that very first crank needs a bang load of fuel, just a ton of fuel up here. And then after the very first time you crank it, it's way down here. I mean, way down here. ID 2000s, all that kind of stuff. With ethanol, you'll get something that looks kind of like this, and it looks bizarre, but it works fantastic. Crank injector time. This is pretty much relative to how large your injector is. So if you've got ID 2000s, you're going to be looking at a value of like 1,000 or less. Okay. If you've got smaller injectors, 550, 800, something like that, you're probably going to be looking at a value of, like 3,000 or something like that. It just depends. Just play with this until you get a pretty quick start. It's going to be a combination between these two graphs that gives you that initial fire up, that crank, 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 boom, when it comes on. And then that's after it starts is when these maps take over, okay? But something interesting on this graph that I want to show you guys, especially you tuners that do this for a lot of people. A lot of people are under the impression that more throttle equals more fuel in starts. And this is true to a point, but here's what you want to do. You want to actually cap this off, and you want to cap it at, say, let's just set this value at like, 1,000 or something like that. Now, why did I do this? Well, if everything's set up right, okay, and your car's starting great in most weather conditions and things like this, you're going to build something that looks kind of like this, all right? It's going to be something like this. And as you give it more throttle, it gives more fuel while you're cranking, okay? Now, if everything is right and everything's fine, and then you'll get people that come back later and all of a sudden the car won't start, they're not thinking if their fuel pump is on or if they don't have fuel pressure or if they forgot to turn something on. They give it full throttle thinking that this is going to give them the most fuel. They think they need more fuel to start the car. Well, that's not the case. What we actually want to do is kind of prevent them from flooding the motor. So you're going to cap this, you're going to bring it down, and then you're going to give it some really low value right here, okay? And what this does is it allows, up to like 50% or something, it does give more fuel. But past that, it gives less fuel because you don't want them flooding the motor. If it won't start, then that means this section and this section, okay, this whole graph and this section of this graph, along with this number, your crank advance, is not right, okay? The car won't fire up. It's this. Bang, bang, bang. It's not anything to do with over here. So just bring it down, cap it off at a low value, and it'll save them from flooding their motor and really causing it not to start. Okay, so after it starts, start extraverse temp. This is a percentage of fuel added on top of your fuel, added on top of not only your fuel map, but also on top of this map. Okay, so you've got your base fuel map, right? Like this is what's happening. This is your main your main values, and then this graph is an additional percentage based on coolant temperature. You need more fuel whenever it's colder. Okay, you guys can play with this for your own particular setup. There's no point in me putting values in there because you guys that are on 92,000s are going to end up seeing something like this, and you guys think this is crazy, but that's almost exactly how it's going to look. There's like nothing with E85 and 92,000s. This graph is way down there. But you other guys that are on like 1,000 cc's in gas, yeah, it will be something, similar to something like this, and it'll look something kind of similar to that. Start extra decay. This tells how long this map is added on top of this map. Okay, so you have this much extra fuel on top of this graph, on top of this graph. Okay, everywhere. This is a global percentage scalar, so it doesn't matter whether it's here, whether it's way up here at 32 pounds or if it's here, it doesn't matter. 20% on all your points here. So you're adding like however much percent you tell it to everywhere on top of this map and on top of your fuel map. And that's more or less it for starts. It's just a matter of playing with the values. These two graphs right here are the main factors in how quickly your car exits this 400 RPM and actually fires up. These are the two big ones, okay? After that, if your car won't hang onto idle or if it's too lean or too rich immediately after you start, then you start looking at these guys. How long it adds extra fuel after starting on top of your warm-up enrichment, which then lays on top of this graph, okay? So it's like 4 tiers here. Now again, what you might have to do, you might have to go back in and actually mess with these values a little bit whenever it's cooler, because mechanically, as things heat and expand, you might get a little more, a little less air. So you might have to actually change these values up here, even though you've done it once it's warm. These values will all be the same because that's what you're targeting whenever it's hot, and it's the same. But you might have to, do an extra 2 or 3% up there, and it's gonna take several times. Don't expect this to be right the first time. You guys want a perfect start. It's probably gonna take 5 or 6 times, unless you've done the same setup 10,000 times and you know exactly the values it takes by heart. That's pretty much it for starts. It's pretty straightforward. As long as everything else is set up correctly and everything is mechanically sound, these fall right into place. They fall right into place, and they're not that difficult to understand. So there's the starts. Next video we'll get into really cleaning up this fuel table and making it look pretty and kind of going through some tuning theory for all this kind of stuff. So thanks for watching. See you in the next one.